All right, now it's time for part two. Let's move on, and this will be less about the data, more about the interpretation. But I still have some data. I can't get away from it. So, last I talked about stop picking on Florida. Now I want to talk about how some things are worth the risk. How can we really assess the risk from this virus? The good news is, after a couple months of study, there are a couple of fundamental things that we have learned about the virus that will help us to assess the risk. I've talked about these numbers before, but I want to return to one of them most of all, because it's the one that we know is very age dependent. And so depending on your age, this number will look very different for you. It's called the infection fatality rate. Basically, out of a certain number of infected people, how many of them will die? The thing about this is it's hard to tell exactly everyone who's been infected. If you catch them with a PCR test, you'll be able to see that they have virus. If you see antibodies, well, you'll be able to see that they had the virus at some point. But the virus leaves your system, antibodies take weeks to develop, and many people are getting this disease with very mild symptoms. I know people personally who are in the 70-ish age range who only had a headache. They tested positive. You can get a mild case of this disease. So the question is, how severe is it? The best measure of severity in the sense of you can't argue that it's severe in the case where you had someone die from it. The other issues are, there are a lot of other issues and risks, but we've got to realize we're in a case where we are in the cloud of unknowing right now, and we don't really know exactly where all the risks are. So this is the case, biggest risk, biggest fear, and most well-defined risk. Infection fatality rate. Here's a paper I'm going to show up, but I want to say that all of these things, when I show a particular paper, I don't mean to say that that paper is particularly good, but it does go along with the general thrust of papers that I've seen. So here's one, and it asks this question: how deadly is COVID-19? Again, I don't think this has been peer-reviewed yet, and I think that if you see, these are data people who are analyzing it. So let's give it the grain of salt that it needs. But let's look at it, because it does go along with what other people have seen. Here, what I like about this paper is they try to look at excess mortality, like I mentioned in my last couple of podcasts. Excess mortality is one way to capture the deaths from COVID-19 that we wouldn't see otherwise. And so they did a lot of analysis. This is analysis on Italian data. I don't think there's anything to say that things are fundamentally different in Italy than they are anywhere else. But I just want to say this goes along with everything else that we've seen. And the other thing is, yeah, this is, if anything, this is definitely a severe example. Italy was one of the places that was hit hardest. So they estimated the IFR, and they found that they actually had a very steep age dependence. They actually find that it's, when people had a hard time detecting the infections, how many infections go undetected? Well, it's kind of like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it exist? Did it happen? And it's kind of like if an infection happens and your immune system fights it off with you only getting a mild headache, did it happen? So trying to estimate this, the number that we've been converging on, and I've talked about this before, is 0.7% for the IFR. That means overall, 7 out of every 1,000 infected people will die from COVID-19. This has always been very age dependent, and the question is, how age dependent? Okay, well, the IFR goes down if you are younger. From this graph right here, combining several studies, it looks like you can read this graph. It's a log scale. I apologize for that, so I'll translate it. If you're under 49, like this 40 to 49 age range, you read over and you see that it's about 0.07%, rounding off. It's an order of magnitude lower than the average IFR. That means out of every 50-year-old and younger, every 10,000 people that catch it, 7 will die. That's higher than any of us wants to deal with, but it's also, you can put it in the range of other risks that people take. If you drive fast, you put yourself at risk of dying from a car crash. How does this risk all work out? Well, I'm just going to report this risk right now, but I'm going to say it is significantly lower if you are younger. In fact, in the 20 to 29 age range, that's what I should say, it's actually 0.02%. That means 2 out of 10,000. 1 out of 5,000 people that catch it in the young age range will perish. The thing to realize is, I did a calculation. At my school, there are about 3,000 undergraduates. This means if every undergraduate at my school got infected, there's a good possibility that we would have one death from it. And so, even though that risk sounds low, you've got to put it in context to say, my goodness, one student from our school dying would be a tragedy. How much of a tragedy? What should we do? Should we shut down the school entirely if there is this risk out there? Or, well, clearly we don't just accept this risk for what it is. We do things like wearing masks, social distancing. But what do we need to do? The extent to which we need to restrict ourselves goes along with the risk that we are going to bear with this. And so I want to say, I've said this before about risk. Risk is inherent. And I love this tweet from Austin Channing Brown. Definitely want to recommend her book as well. White woman asked her how she can support racial justice without any risk. She has bad news for that woman. There's, what's the way that I put it before? Life is risk, Highness. Anyone who tells you different is selling something. I'm proud to say that Austin Channing Brown is not selling something here. She is admitting that there is going to be some risk. If you go out and protest injustice, you are going to be assuming some risk. And in my view, that is a good thing, because you can make those calculations. And like if you're at high risk from having COVID, or if you have symptoms and you think there's a high probability you might have COVID, that would weigh into your risk factor of should I go out and protest. You can't live without risk. The bad news is there's significant risk with COVID-19. The good news is there are people and cases for whom there is lower risk. And so, honestly, as a society, I feel like we're at the breaking point, because I feel like that we have a lot of things contributing to it, and the virus that no one asked for, and the virus that honestly no one deserves, is attacking us, and it's attacking us in an unfair way. The virus itself is unfair. But we've got to be fair in our fight against it. And the thing that is, I see laws being made with good motives for when we're going to move from phase to phase. And these are all going to be arbitrary and confusing. The more you try to restrict from the top down, the more details will be in your law, and the more confused people will get. And confused people means confused police officers. It means confused people who are trying to interpret the rules. And it means clashes between those people, exacerbating all of the inherent and innate issues that are already there. And that's why this has been a kind of unveiling or apocalypse at this time. That's what the word apocalypse means. It means unveiling the divisions that are among us. And now that we're seeing this full in the face, I want to say we're talking about abuses by law enforcement. Those abuses are more likely to happen if you have arbitrary, confusing, and or unnecessary laws. So I just want to say that law enforcement of these laws is confusing, and we even made it more confusing. In King County, we're not even on this chart anymore. We're now between Phase 1 and Phase 2. We have a modified Phase 1 because we weren't able to meet the thresholds for Phase 2, although nobody can explain to me exactly why those thresholds are so important. So I want to say that these issues are big, they are real, and this is somewhat of a chance to get these out into the open and to say, how can we make a more just society? And it's worth risking our bodies to be able to make this kind of social change, right? If that's the case, there are some things that are more important than simply staying closed until there is a vaccine. Some people don't have that option. Some people don't have a comfortable life, and some people don't have the kind of certainty that they even know that there should be food to eat. Now, we have many ways to do it. My own church is giving out food. But is that really the most just society that we can do to sort of patchwork together that kind of thing for the next 6, 7, 8 months until we have a vaccine? And that's even if people take it, you know? So we've got to weigh risks in this case. And so what is the risk of reopening? Switzerland is an example that's given by this scientist from Europe. And I like this scientist's tweets because I think he talks about some very interesting things. He's pointing out that Switzerland, the lockdown ended on May 11th, and there hasn't been any uptick in cases. Now, notice on a per capita basis, Switzerland is actually about as big as Washington is, and they had about 3 times as many cases at their peak as Washington did. So in a sense, they have had more cases. Have they been mismanaged? Well, now that the cases have gone down, they've reopened, they don't have any kind of cases going back up. Their plateau is now lower. And the scientist is talking about 3 possible reasons the cases are not going up as much as he would expect that they did. Residual distancing done by the people of their own volition. I think I think all these are good. The second one is seasonality. We don't really know yet, but it's really looking like there's something to the fact that warmer weather may help slow the disease like it does for other coronaviruses. The one last thing that he mentions is cross-immunization. Remember, other coronaviruses have similar structures. Some people's immune system might have recognized these structures and be able to fight it off. Does that mean that they won't get the disease at all? Does it mean they'll have a milder form because they're already primed to fight it off? We don't know yet. But let me tell you something. There's a structural biochemical hypothesis that I've developed that we are testing right now in my biochemistry class using computer tools. So look for information on that very soon. I think this is a real possibility. I'm spending time in class trying to weigh out a hypothesis for how cross-immunization might work. All that is to say, we don't know enough to say for sure, but these are 3 possible good things. I've been looking for good surprises, and these might be some of them. There are risks to reopening. Here's Houston, and Houston hospitalizations in Houston, in a particular hospital there. They have the light blue diamond shows phase 1 reopening on May 1st. The darker blue diamond farther to the right shows phase 2 reopening on May 18th. And you can see after the light blue diamond, the cases stayed flat. After the dark blue diamond, cases are slowly going up. So it is worrisome. It's similar to the kind of report that I got from my friend in the Florida hospital. You have this 7-day trend, it's going up. It can't continue too long, or else the hospital will be overwhelmed. And yet this is not the kind of emergency red light. It's the kind of, okay, we expected cases to go up. They're going up more than they did in Switzerland, right? But they're not going up that much more. This is worrisome, but we've got a lot of other things to worry about too. And I think this is so far is within the bounds of acceptable risk of reopening. That's the main thing. If we're talking about risks, and risk assessment has always been a field in science that's been somewhat problematic. And problematic means it's a great thing for academics to get around and talk about. But now we have a case where everybody is interested in risk assessment. And so science is weighing in. Listen to science. Science is estimating the risk of COVID-19 to the body. Science does not have a way to measure the soul. This actually reminds me of a book by Walker Percy called Love in the Ruins, but that's another story for another day. Science cannot measure the soul. The soul is not measurable. It's a whole person relating to others, and I believe it is more important than the body. Whether you believe it's more important to the body or some kind of construct that we do to summarize other data, okay, we can debate about that another day. The main thing I'm going to say here is science has a very hard time capturing it. What use is it if we save the body while we destroy the soul? What use is it if we have restrictions that prevent people from visiting their 90-year-old grandparents who are now developing dementia, and because of the restrictions are accelerating that? What use is that? We've got to ask these hard questions, and the answer is not just because the governor decided this. We've got to, as citizens, look at this and work it out. And that is why I support the protests. Because the protests show that justice is more important than the body. Don't get me wrong, the body is still important. But there are some things that are more important. I've seen this about scientists, and of course I like this. You know, if I'm a scientist, somebody's showing this, every disaster movie begins with the scientist being ignored. Great, listen to the scientist and you won't be in a disaster movie. That doesn't logically follow, okay? This is very true. But there's also disaster movies where mad scientists begin them. Scientists can be motivated by bad things. And so I've got to realize, just because I'm a scientist, you've got to listen to the group of scientists and realize that even the group of scientists might be missing something. Scientists need to listen to other people. Scientists need to listen to the governors to talk about how the people are doing and reacting to the politics. What kind of laws? Law and science are not the same thing. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that they are. When you see this kind of sign, I always think of Syndrome from the Incredibles, who is a bad guy who is a science villain. He basically doesn't have superpowers by himself, but he makes devices to be able to be a bad guy. It's a whole class of kind of villains. And just remember, we've had a lot of experience with heroes and villains and resistance and rebels and things like that. You are not defined by your occupation. You can have a scientist who's a hero and a scientist who's a villain. Or you can have a scientist who's somewhere in between, or you can have the Breaking Bad tragedy. You can have all sorts of things. Science is an occupation. The hero or villain is a moral, ethical judgment. You are a hero or you're a villain depending on how you direct your soul. And I want to say there are examples in the literature of people who've directed their souls wrongly. Syndrome's science is accurate. His devices work, but he uses them for a bad end. And I've got to say that there's also certain kind of villains that I've been reminded of. Villains who impose laws on other people, impose restrictions on the hero. Here's Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame, and here's Mother Gothel from Tangled. Both of these villains are primarily villains because they tell the hero, they imprison the hero in some way. This is the kind of villainy that science can adopt if it only looks at one side of the situation. You know, it is a dangerous world out there. There are cases where there's songs, right, where they argue this to the hero. They do have an element of plausibility, because you can see that they are scared by the world out there, and there are risks. They are not necessarily lying about the risks, but they are exaggerating the importance of the risks. How do you balance risks? I don't quite know yet, but I know we have 3 months of data now that can tell us there are some cases and some countries where they're taking on risks like school openings, they're taking on risks like allowing certain kinds of assemblies. And we as a country have taken on the risk of thousands of people in outdoor places, most but not all with masks, most but not all silent or quiet, but some very loud. Well, what's the data? And I've been watching it. I have not seen a huge spike in cases yet, and hospitals are doing okay after a week of protests. So let's deal with the protesters. Let's get them off the streets by listening to them and by responding to them as a legal system should. And let's bring law and justice together in this case. So that's mainly what I'm saying. I'm saying as a scientist, what I'm really saying is don't listen to me too much. I'm going to give you the graphs. I'm going to let you look at them and let you interpret them. I'm going to give you my conclusions, and I'm going to say these go on with most other scientists that I've talked to. So don't listen to the scientist who's standing out as a lone wolf and saying, hey, I'm right and all those other people are wrong. But also don't listen to the scientists who say, we have a monopoly on being right here, or you can have a monopoly on being right, on having the data, but on interpreting the data, that is everybody's job. And I want to say that scientists are not very good always at being empathetic or understanding. I don't think many scientists understood the kind of stress that they're putting all of our communities under. And so when we have these protests, when people are saying that this is more important than your scientific findings about how we should stay inside until we have a vaccine, that's the kind of thing in a democracy where we need to listen to each other. And that's why I'm saying listen to other people. The golden rule, it's everywhere, and it should be everywhere. But it's also surprisingly hard to live by. Don't impose restrictions on others you don't impose on yourself. This goes, at the first level, this is don't be a hypocrite. Don't be like those people, those epidemiologists in England who snuck out when they imposed a quarantine on everyone else, on those politicians who somehow get haircuts when no one else can get one. But the other rule is to imagine the world of the other and to put yourself in their shoes and say what's important to them that's not important to me. And yet, by honoring them, I should let them do it. If I want to be able to do X, they should be able to do Y. We know more about the risks now. And so the goalposts should change. That's the way science is different than sports. We can change the goalposts because we can measure where the risks are and balance the risks. This virus is a risk, but like I showed you at the beginning, it's a different risk for different people. It's a significant risk, even for the young. But it changes depending on who you are and how you act. We've already brought down the R0. The R0 is a number that can be brought down. It's the transmissibility. Social distancing brings it down. Now the R0 maybe is around 1. It would be great to be able to stamp it out, but we have to balance the risks of stamping it out versus the risks of the things we have to cut back on to stamp it out. We have a constitution that's very good, and the Bill of Rights especially, at saying the kind of rights that people should have. And so I want to appeal to that. I want to say right to peaceful assembly, right to worship. The government shall not impose restrictions on parts of the populace that it's not willing to impose on others. The government has to be fair. That's easier said than done, I realize. But I want to say that we are seeing physically, I believe that we can do some things that we were told that we can't. So what are those things? Let's add it all up and let's try to say. So I want to just go back to the two big numbers. Very transmissible, R0 equals 3. Somewhat deadly, IFR equals 0.7%. Remember that actually the problem with this virus is its transmissibility. And also there's unknown long-term effects. I just heard from someone else who has long-term effects that were unpredicted, and this is from a presumed case of COVID. I'm willing to go beyond presumed to say I'm sure it was. But I know 2 people now that have month-long repercussions from this that are really weird. Viruses are nasty and they get into your system. So I want to say we need to take this very seriously, but as we do this, we can look and say, okay, how can we take this seriously and take other things seriously as well? So I just want to return to this graph. Look for yourself and your age on this graph, or you can go by what I have over here. By the way, that line right there is a 1% IFR, and you can see 60 and up have a 1% or higher IFR. That means 1 out of 100 people who are 60 and older will die if they catch the disease. Of the people who are 60 to 69, 99 of them will live. That number 99 goes down. It goes down, but you can see by how far it goes down. Let me know if you have trouble reading this graph. It's the axis is a little weird, but scientists love our log graphs, I gotta say. It really comes down to what risks should you take. We don't know. We can't control this virus. And that's why I'm arguing for a strategy of mitigation rather than suppression. I don't think we should shut everything down and scrub the floors if we have one case of somebody's mother, okay, at an institution or a school or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but I think we should all be looking at this and thinking about what are the risks we are willing to take. And let people take the risks they are going to take. Give people the latitude that you want to take. And if you feel like you're still afraid of this and you're high risk, then stay home, and I want to support you doing that in whatever way I can, legally, and if you're one of my students and things like that. We have been successful at putting on the brakes. We now have a case where 3 states are in trouble right now. Most of the other states seem to be doing okay, even at various levels of opening. You have to keep an eye on it. We're not sure yet. But we're doing better. Within the predictions the experts have made, I am not going to say the experts were wrong. Some of them were wrong, and we can suss that out as we go through. But we're within the bounds of uncertainty. We are tending toward, when they have the error bars of outcomes possible, I've noticed something. I've noticed that we tend to actually come in below average, at or below average, and usually we're trending toward the lower end of the error bar. And I actually have a couple of predictions people have made over the last week or two, and I'm holding on to those, and I'm going to come back to those in a month, and we'll see if this is the case. If this is the case, the lower error bounds seem to be, it seems like the models are definitely pessimistic. And what are the things? Remember that I have the 3 things that might be helping us here that we didn't account for in the models. The continued distancing, which we can all control. Seasonality and cross-immunity, which we cannot control. But I do want to say, I hope very soon to get to you with my results of our cross-immunity study, where we're going to see if there is some kind of cross-immunity between SARS-2 and the common cold. My students are working on that right now. We are going to get together on Thursday and talk to each other about the results that we get. So it's pretty exciting to be doing this with an undergraduate class of biochemists. And I will leave you with that cliffhanger. So be watching for that. In the meantime, do continue to distance, but also consider what is the risk that is yours and what risk are you willing to take. As you think about that, it's a hard decision. So I just pray for wisdom for all of us. And I pray for tolerance and empathy and justice. All those really good things, right? So let's hope that things are better in a couple days when I make another one of these. Until then, take care.